Stack Overflow. Okay, thank you. Welcome again to everybody. This is the lecture number 13, and this class will be focused on pandas and Seaborn. Let's start now. Bon appetit if you're eating. So again, I will give you a little reminder of the different links that you can use for this class. You can again use our Stack Overflow if you have some questions. For this particular lecture, you will need to install one single module, and I think if you successfully install other modules, that should be as easy today. You can visit our online course page that has a lot of links. You'll find there all the videos that will help you to redo this class at maybe a slower pace, and you'll be able to copy and paste all the commands that you find in this Jupyter notebook. So today we are going to recap on the different modules that we have used. Jupyter notebook, obviously, it's a great environment, especially for plotting, you'll see that. And we are going to use our Panda data frame, matplotlib, and I will introduce you to the new module for plotting, which is Seaborn. Again, great here link that will help you to have all the manual for these different modules. And please, I recommend you to use these cheat sheets that contains a lot of description of all the functions that are available, and it will help you to quickly find the function that you will need for your scripts. Okay, so so what we have learned in the previous class is how to play with the data frames and how to extract specific subsets of this data frame. Also, we've done the same for NumPy arrays. And you have seen during the last lecture how to make graphs with matplotlib. And basically, this class is a little bit the same idea, but it's an add-on. Everything will be a little bit advanced, and you'll see the power of Pandas. So we are going to discuss together about how to create new rows and columns. There are many ways to do it. Another functionality that is very convenient with Pandas is how to group and aggregate data. You will see also how you can apply functions so that you can modify your data very quickly. You can do it for a row or for a column. So we can also restructure the shape of your data, and we can put together some information that data using different tool for conversion. And the second part of this presentation will focus on Seaborn. Okay, so I would start by importing these three modules. You can use these aliases as usual: PD for pandas, NP for NumPy, and PLT for matplotlib. Actually, here I have to add pyplot. Okay, that's important here. And okay, then you run it. Okay, it worked, and let's go. So we'll start with a simple data frame. So here we can create a data frame from this dictionary. So we'll have these values of zeros and one, and for the column A and B. Okay, so we are going to play with this simple, very simple Panda data frame at first. It will help us to understand what's happening. Okay, so we can use the command append if we want to add rows. And you see that's actually very convenient, okay? That's one way to add rows. Another way is to use lock. So we are going to see how we can use lock to append some new rows. Okay, so let's start here by creating I'm going to copy everything so that everything will be clear. I'm creating this simple data frame. Okay, that looks like this. Okay, so that's the data frame called df. So now we can use append. So if you use append, we are just going to give to append as an argument this dictionary that contains the name of the column and the value that you want to add. You can also add this information, this argument, if you want to ignore the index. So if you do this automatically, it will add this index that will be just the next integer. So the last index was 3, now it's 4. We can also use lock. So what you give to lock here between brackets, it's actually the number of the index here, or you can also give the row name. So the little trick that we're going to use here to just have the next index number, we can use the len of the data frame, which is here 5. So if we do this, it will add these values as a new row that has an index 5. And if you give one single variable, you can see that A and B will have this variable here, 100. You can also use it that way. So if you, instead of using one variable, you can give actually a list. It will now add these 2 values. You can also, if you're interested to add non-available values, you can use this NaN object from NumPy. And now you see that it's understood very well that this data is not accessible. And what you can do as well, if you're not very careful, you can add a new row with an index that doesn't follow the others. Let's give here an example when I put this index 10 and I want to have 2 values equal to 9. So that's what happened. So this is very flexible. You can do that. It's maybe not a good idea. You have to be careful about that. So here again, you have a row that has an index 10. The previous row had an index of 7. If you want to make sure that everything is following the right numbering for your index, you can use this function that I like to use very often. It's called reset index. And now, if you do it, let's do df equal, and now exactly. So df reset index return a new data frame that here you have to override the previous one. And if you don't use this drop argument like that, you might be interested in that. It will actually create a new column that contains the previous indexes. So that's a very simple way to add rows, okay? Now let's move on and see how we can add columns. So there are again many ways to do it. Here, the first thing you can do, you can actually just use indexing. So again, we are going to use for indexing the brackets. So I'm creating the same data frame here. And what I can do, I can add a new column, which can be here named C, and I can add all the values. So that's very important here that these values, the size of this list is the same as the number of rows that you have in your data frame. What you can do as well, you can here just give one variable, and every row will have this variable. So let's run it, and that's what you have here. Good. That's actually a very, I would say, a very simple way to add columns. That's probably the way that I use the most. You have other ways. You can feel them that they're redundant, but sometimes they can be more useful. So another way is to use assign. So first we are describing here a function to actually calculate the square. I'll show you how we can use it. Again, we're going to start from the same data frame here, and we can assign now and add a new column by using assign. And we can as well here, this is actually an advantage, you can actually assign 2 different columns. So if I do this, now you see that here we created C that has only 5, and created as well D and G that contains this different list of 4 elements. Another way to do it, you can also, if you are interested, you can use square. And now you actually adding this Okay, I'm checking what's happening. Okay, we still have some errors with Conda. Okay, sorry, let's move on. And yeah, so that's the way you can use assign. So you see that if you use assign, basically, if you use assign, you can just add a column in order. So you add a column on the right of the last column. But you might be interested in inserting a column in a different position here. So for this, you can use the function insert. Okay, so it's a in place operation, and let's see how it works. So basically, I created the same data frame, and then I'm gonna add insert at this position. So to define the position of my insert, I can use the argument lock. And here again, as a trick, the length of the number of columns that I have will automatically add my new column on the right of my data frame. So let's see how it looks like. Okay, so you see that I did actually here my data frame, my column. I can also, if I want to add different values, same as what we have used before, I can give a list of values. And again, because we use here log equal to the length of the number of columns that we have, it will create and insert the column at on the right side of my data frame, but I can change it if I want. I can put log 2, and if I do this, here the column will be named E. Now you see that E has been added here in position 2. And again, I would like to conclude here with this, this little trick. You can always change the order of your columns. And to do that, you can use all the little tricks about indexing. If you use this type of index, you are going to return this list in an inverted order. So if I do this, you see here the order is A, B, E, C, D. If I run this now, it should, appear exactly in the other order. So you can reorganize your column using here this trick and giving the index of the columns that you want to have in the right order. Okay, good. So there are other more advanced way to add rows or columns. And one of the great functions that you can use with a Panda is the aggregation function, AGG. So aggregate function is actually, you can be applied to add rows or columns to an existing data frame. And you'll see that how we can use it. So again, if you want to add to rows or columns, you have to use this argument asys equal 1 for column and 0 for rows. Again, my trick to remember it, it's row for 0 and 1, which is more like vertical to column. Anyway, this is my way to remember it. And then what you can do with the aggregate is that it's a very powerful tool because you can apply different functions, a list of functions to add multiple columns in one line. So let's see how it works. So I'm going to here comment that. And again, we start on the same data frame. And what I want to do now, I want to actually, by column, have an information about the standard deviation or the sum, the mean, the max, or the minimum per columns. So you can see that Ag can actually take this list of different functions. Either it could be a string with the name of the function, but it could also take the NumPy object. So I think you can probably replace this by the string sum. It will give you the same results. So let's see how it works. I'm going to command this and okay, so that's what it's returning. So it's actually returning a new data frame. So it's a new data frame, and now we can see that per column, you have now a value for all these different, that these functions returns. If you want to concat this data frame to your previous data frame, you can just use the trig that we've seen together. So you can just use here indexing, and let me uncomment, and let's just print here the F. I like to remind you here that if you put the F here, Jupyter Notebook will understand that it has to print it. And that's how it worked. So now we actually created new columns. We gave the name for this column, and then this is what the Agg function return, a new data frame. So that's a nice way actually to put together these two different data frames. Okay, so that's actually, I imagine, a very simple way to make statistics when you have a Panda data frame, and Agg is actually very powerful for that. What we can look at now is how we can add new rows. So I think it's a little subtleties. So let's illustrate this with this example. And again, that's, I think, a nice way to show you that you have to be careful when you add new rows and when you actually use Agg. So let's discuss about it. So again, we start with the same data frame. And now what we want to do here, we want to actually add a total. And for the total here, we could just use Agg and sum function. And because we wanted the total in this dimension, here we use axis equals 0, okay? So now this is df. So in one line, you can see here that it was very quick to add the total. And again, we can now, on that updated df, we can use Agg again, and we can append the result of Agg like that. And that's a very actually nice way to just here, you can see that you can add these new values corresponding to the mean, the max, and the average for these different columns. Here you can play with that. The way you do it, you have to actually be careful, because you can see here that the maximum value is also including the total. So if you want to avoid that, you can just maybe forget about this line. And here you can add the sum. And if you add the sum here, I think, let's comment it here. Yes, now we have the sum, and you can see that now the maximum doesn't include the sum. So when it was here better idea to use this aggregate function before adding this new line on my data frame. So go slowly, and you'll see that you have a lot of functionalities that you can play with using this this function Agg. Okay, so Agg is great because you can use it on multiple columns, but if you want, you can use a little variant, which is called apply. Apply is great because you can also use all different type of functions that you want. I didn't give you too many details here, but when you use Agg, you had only a list of functions that we could use. There are typical statistical functions, pretty basic, that you can use, such as we see the size, the count, standard deviation. If you prefer, you can use the standard error of the mean. But if you want something a little bit different, I would recommend to use then apply, and apply can take any function. So for instance, here I can just use this NumPy function, it is a square, and let's see how it works. Okay, so we created here a data frame that actually has this value that is not available. And we can see that just using here apply, we can just have the result of this function for every single values. So yes, so when you play with apply and agg, be careful, and they are like two different variants. And now I will show you how apply is actually pretty useful if you want to normalize a column, for instance. Something that I think you have seen in the previous lecture with the NumPy arrays. Okay, so again, there are many ways to normalize your data. Here we are going to use an example based on the min-max normalization. So the minimum value should be 0, and the maximum value should be 1. And again, we start with the same data frame. And what we can do, you can see here by just using this simple syntax, we can take a value for a column, take the minimum, and then we can divide it by the maximum minus the minimum, something that we've seen in the previous class. So let's see, you'll see that it's a pretty simple way to do it. So first, I'm gonna, comment this line. So let's see how it works. So, okay, so here we now running, and okay, so I have to return something. So let's put here df up, and that's what we have now. So you see that now all the data is it just normalized, and that took just one line. So again, you can just here call a column that way, and that's a very simple way to apply these functions. So what I wanted to show you here is that if you can, we are going to see how to plot the data. Okay, so but I cannot resist the temptation already to show you a graph, because I think they are fun, and it's actually a nice way to see what's happening, even though the data here is pretty simple. But I told you in the previous class that there is a nice way to plot data, and we can just use a data frame, and then there is a method called plot, and here you can give the style of the plot with a bar plot, and we can just plot here the result. So this is the data that was not normalized. If we want to plot the data that was normalized, we can just do it that way. And we are going to see now, yeah, the two plots. So you can see here that here the maximum is 4 and here the maximum is 1. So it worked. It's just a nice way to check what's happening. But again, later in this lecture, we are going to discuss more deeply about how to make nice graph. That's just a simple way for you to represent the data. Okay, so I think later in this lecture, we are going to talk again about normalization. So let's move on. Again, the temptation was too high here. I could not resist about giving you another way to normalize the data. It's a little bit out of the scope of this lecture, but if you need to normalize the data, there are many ways to do it. Here we use just minimum maximum, but it's actually a very important operation to do on your data. And if you want to go for more fancy methods for pre-processing your data, you can use this great module that we are going to, I'm sure, describe more deeply in the next lectures, but it's called sklearn. It's a module that has a lot of tools for to treat the data, to do some machine learning and all this type of learning and way to represent multi-dimensional data. So just here, using this module, we can actually use this function that is called a min-max scaler. That's the one we were actually applying here, and you can see that the result is exactly the same as what we used before. So again, this is very practical, but if you want to deal with a more fancy way to normalize the data, please, I encourage you to look at the documentation of sklearn. Yes, that's pretty much it now. So, okay. So we've seen how to add data, how to add by column or by rows information about the statistics of your data, such as having standard deviation of the mean. But you just want maybe to modify your data. You can modify rows or modify columns. So let's see how it works. So we start with the data frame here. Okay, that's the same. And what we can just do, we can add that way. We can add 5 to all the values located in the column A. So that's a pretty simple syntax. We can also use all types of operation. There is this operation called modulo that is actually pretty useful if you want to know if you're dealing with, for instance, even or odd numbers. So you can use modulo 2. And so as an example, I'm going to create an array that has 9 elements from 0 to 9. And I'm going to apply modulo 2 to that. And okay, let's see what's happening. And that's basically what it's giving me. So if it's odd number, it's going to be a 0. So even number is going to be 1. Oh, sorry, the other way around. Yes, and then, so you can, again, you can apply this to B if you're interested. And let's see. And okay. So now, okay. So what you can do now, you can, if you want, you can use lock. So that's actually, again, a very useful function. And we can say here, any number that was actually where the modulo was equal to 0, now we are going to add 1 to that value. So you can, if you want, you can modify a value applying a condition before. So that's actually a very nice way to modify your data if you're just interested in modifying a couple of columns or a couple of rows according to different conditions that you can add together here at the infinite, really using the log function. Okay, now we'll have, I guess, to go pretty slowly because it's a very powerful tool that we can use with the Panda data frames. However, I would say it might take some time to get familiar, and you'll have to apply them many times. But that's actually a great way to group the data together. So to do this, we are going to first start with a little data set that we can download. And something very nice actually in Seaborn is that you have a lot of data sets that are already accessible. And it's perfect because if you don't have a data set to work with, just use low data set. Here we're going to use a data set called Wrights. It's a data set that gives some information about the number of passengers who took a plane between 1949 and 1960. And we just are going to play with this data. There are many different data frames that you can use. And it's a pretty easy way for you to start playing with all these tools. So because we are going to use actually this data frame, you have to install Seaborn. So I'll show you a little bit later how to install Seaborn, but you can guess that you can just apply a conda command. But first, let's just download this data frame and just look at the way it looks like. So if you don't want to print an entire data frame, like it's too big, you can use head or tail. So again, if you just print head, it will print by default the 5 first rows of your data frame. If you want to know a little bit more, you can, but it's argument 10. So now we have the 10 first rows. And on the other hand, if you're interested by the tail of your data frame, you can use the function tail. So that just gives you an idea about what is in your data set. Okay. I'm just reading the messages, and you're right, Tobias. Yes, if you actually use the sklearn approach for normalization, it's not going to give you a Panda data frame. So that's actually, I mean, you can now pretty easily switch from one to another. The transformation is easy, but this is always something to be aware. According to the tool that you use, even if they seem equivalent, they might not return exactly the same type of data. So you can switch from one to another, but just be careful with the type of data that is returned by the function. Okay, so what we can do now, we can just use the group by function. So it's a perfect function if you, for instance, want interested in finding how many passengers took a plane and flew each year. So let's illustrate this example by running the command. So we are going to just first, I would like to comment the end of my command like that way, and we're just going to now group by our data frame by year. So remember, this data frame has 144 lines, including the 0, and it has 3 columns: years, month, and the number of passengers. Okay, so if you run this, it will actually give you an object, and this is what actually it's actually well explained here, that group by doesn't return the piece of data frame you want, but it will actually return this object. And to then have an answer to the question, you have to use a function from this group by. So here we can use, for instance, sum. So let's see, and I think it will be obvious when I will run this command that now what I did is that I merged and I grouped by all my data by year, and what my data contain now, it's here the sum of all the passengers. And what you can see here is that we group by year, but we had also information about the passenger and the month. And you can see that it didn't return information about the month is because probably it couldn't find a way to sum months together. So it just returned the sum of passengers. And you can see how Panda is very versatile, but also like a clever tool that will try to avoid you these kind of troubles. Okay, so this is a nice way. So we, from this long data frame that I like to print here entirely, just to illustrate it, we now have this new data frame that is actually give you a number of passengers by year. Okay. If you really want to understand what's happening here, you can use this command. And I think it's a command that I've learned from Mark. So that's a very nice trick. Thank you, Mark. So you can use here the agg together with the list function. And what it will return, it will return here the list that contains now each of these columns. And you can see here that this one contains the list of months, and here you have the list of values for the passengers. And this is how actually group by works. So that's actually a very nice way to visualize how these functions are working together. Thank you, Mark, for this little trick. What you can also use this functionality is the same as using agg on the data frame. So you can now use agg that way. So let's together with a group by, and we'll be able to actually have information about the sum, the mean, and the max. And that's what we have now. So instead of just having the number of passengers, we have a little bit more information. Still, everything is grouped by year, as we define here. Okay, so that's the way it looks like. So I'm sure that you you start to have a feeling about how powerful is actually the group by function. Okay. So we can start now that we're getting familiar with these different tools. We can ask different questions. The first question we might want to ask is, for instance, finding the average number of passengers per month. And if you are using Excel, I let you imagine how hard it would be to do it in Excel. I've been using Excel a long time ago, and now playing with Pandas, I have no idea how really quickly you can just do this kind of simple way to transform your data. So the first thing I can do, you can use group by and the mean function to achieve this. So we are going to use this command. So we can group by now by month, and then we can get the mean per month. And that's what we have here. So I let you look at this output. We have the month, we have the year, and we have the passengers, okay? And we have the mean value, okay? But I don't know if you noticed, but we get information about the year, and Panda didn't know it was a year. So when he calculated the mean, he actually gave us a result that has that looks like more float, and we have a year here that is 1954.5, which is probably something that we are not really interested. So that's something we can try to fix. Okay, so to fix this, we can first subset our data. So here to subset data, we are going to use the typical indexes. So here we are going to pull out the month and the passengers from our data. Okay, and only on this data now we are going to group by month and calculate the mean. So let's do it, and there is no year information anymore, and now we have this value actually that represents the mean per month. Okay, so this is, I would have to say again, this is an example that has been given by Mark, who actually gave me all the material that we're using for this class. So thank you, Mark. I think this example is great. I'm not sure I could have found like something as illustrative for these different tools. And especially now we're going to do something very nice. So what if we're interested in having the medium number of passengers per month, but with 5 years increments? So every 5 years we want this information so that we can have a little bit an idea about how this number of passengers per month evolved by pieces of 5 years. Okay, so we're going to mean across these 5 years increments. Okay, so to do this, we will have to proceed step by step. Okay, so the first trick that we'll have to use is how can we create a variable that will contain information about our 5 years increment. And what we can do is we can use this little trick. So I will just apply it step by step. I think it's probably the best way to do it. Again, so now I can print. So the first step will be to define the minimum value for the year. So let's print it, and that's 1949. So we can use this value actually as the first year, and then from this value we can add actually 5 years step by step with this increment. So the way to do it, we can use actually this integer flow division that actually remove the remainder and that return actually an integer from this operation. So the advantage of this operation is that you can just by, I gave you here an example, but if you just subtract the minimum value and you just use this integer flow operation, division operation, you will now create the category corresponding to your years. So let's see how it looks like. So maybe what I should do step by step, I will first, to explain this, I'm gonna maybe this. So let's see. And okay, I was too generous when I copied. Okay, so this is the linear, or we have to use lambda here. Sorry, so remember, we are going, not the tree that we are going to use, it's the function lambda, which is an anonymous function. Toby explained this in his lecture. It's just a simple way to apply a function without naming it. It's just one line. If it's a simple function, it's very quick and versatile, and you can use it that way. And so I think, sorry, I'm gonna just using it that way, sorry, because I think you have to apply it. And okay. Oh, so many L's. So let's just, sorry, move forward here. I just wanted to illustrate all the details of this function. What if I plot df here? Okay, up. Okay, that's what we have here. So again, we take the year, and then we, with the lambda here and the apply function, we subtract the minimum year. So if it was 1949, we subtract 1949, which is going to give you a 0, and then we can just use then this integer floor division. So if it's in the first years, it's going to give you a 0, and then after it will give you 1. So let me just illustrate that by doing and plotting the first 10 years, maybe up. Okay, we need like a little bit more than this, and okay, a little bit more. Actually, let me plot the whole thing, maybe. Yes, so now if we move forward with the years, you see like here, now we are in the second category, so now this value is 1. So we can use this little trick now to actually group by this 5-year period column so that we have our statistics. Okay, so that's the way we've done it. And then what we can do now that we do that, we can just actually group by. So we can drop, okay, so what we need to do here is that now that we have this information about the year, we're not interested in this column. So the first thing that we're going to do, we are going to discard that column. And to do this, we are going to use the function drop. So it will just return a data frame that doesn't contain this column. And then from that new data frame, we can, in the same line, group by month and this 5 years period and calculate the mean. So we run it, and this is basically what we get running this command. So now for each month and for each 5-year period time, so this is the first 5 years and then the following 5 years and the following 5 years, we calculated actually the median of number of passengers. So you can see how it's also, it looks pretty nice when we just return this in our Jupyter notebooks. And that's an example of how we can play with the group by and calculate actually some statistics group by group. Okay, so that's what it returned. Okay, and I think this is an alternate approach that is actually a little bit nicer, because here it's not very informative when you look at 0, 1, and 2. Maybe you already forgot what it is. So again, there are like 5 years and the following 5 years, and again the following 5 years. So you can change this variable to something that will look a little bit nicer. So the way to do this, you can use the lambda function again. But here lambda will actually return a string. So this is the string that is going to be returned using the apply function, and it's formatted. So here you have to give 2 arguments. So you can use, again, the same trick with actually this type of division. And when you do this, again, you have to define the axis, which is here column. Run it again here. And that's a little bit nicer. You can see that instead of having this 0 and 1 and 2, now we have actually the real 5 years increments. I'm thinking about something about axis. If you don't remember if axis should be 1 or 0, you can also use a string. And I think if you use columns like that, it should work as well. Yes, so exactly. You can, if you don't like using 1 or 0 for axis to know to which dimension of your data frame you want to use for your operation, you can just use the strings rows or columns with an S. Okay, and then so that's the head. Okay, so we can also draw up the year again, and using the same operation that we used before. And this is our final data frame. Here again, we use head to have just the first 10 lines. And this is exactly what we try to, the question we try to answer, that is here summarized in this table. Okay, okay, there is something else that we are going to look at now. It's how we can actually convert what is called a long format to a wide format. And for that, we're going to use the pivot function. So the pivot function will actually be very helpful when you have to change the dimension of your data frame and change how they actually the data is organized. So let's just move forward. The first step that is important before you actually pivot your table is to actually reset your indexes. And that's something that we've seen already. So here we're going to take our final data frame. We're going to reset the indices. And now that we've done it, it looks that way. So you can see that doing this, it changed a little bit from this format. Okay, but that's requirements before applying a pivot. And then, so you have here a description of 3 arguments that are required when you want to apply the pivot function. So the first one is the index. So it will actually set the index that you want, the column that you want to make your new index. So we can take any column, and this column will become your new index. Okay. And then you can decide the column that you want to use to make your new data frame. So that's the second argument. And then you can decide what kind of values you want to put inside. So in a way, and I think the best here is to actually to run it, but it's actually a very nice way to change the way that looks like. So this is here the way we use it. So it will return a data frame that we are going to call wide, okay, to avoid confusion. We apply pivot to it. We want the new index to be the month. The column will be this 5 years period increment, and the values we want to put in this table are the number of passengers. So let's run it, and okay, so it worked. So let's see how it looks like. Okay, enter, and yep, that's what we wanted to have. So you see, as a result now, the indices are the month. We have at the column, we have all these 5 years periods that we have defined, and we have here the values for the passengers. If you want to make a histogram of this, I think you can just use this simple function. So you take your data frame, and then you just use the hist method that is included already in your data frame object. And when I draw this histogram, I like to define a range, which will, for the histogram, be the the minimum value and the maximum value of your histogram. And yeah, that's the way it looks like. So you can see that between 45 and 50. So here you have a histogram of month. So the total of this bar should be 12. And you can see how actually these numbers change. And here on the x-axis, you have actually number of passengers. So you can see how actually the number of passengers is increasing over these 5 years periods. That's just a simple and quick way to plot the data. But if you want to do it nicely, we are going to describe how to do it later with Seaborn. Okay, actually, speaking about Seaborn, we don't have too much time. So I just want to say here that if you want to invert whatever you have created with pivot, you can use melt. I'll let you play with that. It takes different, again, 3 arguments, and you can change the shape. Doesn't work. It's maybe because I changed something here, but okay, you'll see that you can revert the your pivot operation just using the meld function. I don't know why it's not working here. I tried to figure out, and this modified script, I'll upload it to make it accessible to you. However, these functions are pretty advanced, so I always would recommend to you to just look at the manual. If you go to a Panda webpage, you'll find a lot of examples about how you can use actually a pivot and a melt all together. So I guess here what's happening is that I changed this df-wise. Okay. There, I can see that Toby gave also like other way to play with this. We are not trying to be exhaustive here in all the way of treating the data. We're using here a pivot. It's a fantastic function, but you'll have access to a lot of different functions as is suggested. Okay, Pandas is endless, exactly. And I have to admit that I have learned so many of these functions, and I use a lot of not as elegant tricks to play with my Pandas. And these tricks makes your code very short, condensed, and elegant in a way. So it will take time for you to get familiar with all these methods I like here to conclude on Pandas. You can look at the cheat sheets. Will actually give you an idea of how many different functions you can use. You can, there are different ways to put your join or concatenate your data frame together, and there are a lot of tricks that could be used, especially when you want to make sure that you're dealing well with your NAN on available data. So it's really endless, and there is no way if we get familiar with Pandas and the way to deal with the data that you'll come back to any other tools such as Excel. Okay, so I'll give you a little bit of time now to install Seaborn. Again, the recommendation is to use Conda, so you can on your terminal. So if you are using Visual Studio Code, it's on top. You have the menu terminal, and then inside you just run terminal, and inside the terminal you just run this command. And later on in your Jupyter notebook, you can just import Seaborn using this alias. Again, as I like to say, don't change it. The alias, the standard alias for Seaborn is SNS. And if you copy and paste code from the web, you'll find out that you don't have to change it because everybody is using the same alias. Okay, so the first thing I like to say is why Seaborn, why I try to convince you during an hour and a half during the last lecture that Matplotlib can do everything. It's true. Seaborn is just an additional layer on Matplotlib. It's actually using Matplotlib, but the power of Seaborn is actually using the Pandas way to organize the data, and the way the data is separated by category. Seaborn will very quickly understand how to plot the data. It will give you options so that you can produce a graph in a couple of lines. So I think, yeah, as I said earlier in my introduction, Seaborn is probably an answer to the amazing graph that could be actually produced with R or MATLAB. And now I would say with Seaborn, you have an equivalent to produce graphs that will look like final for your publications. Okay, so again, so you have a little bit of documentations, and I'm going to start with one of the simple type of plot that we can produce, a bar plot. So you see it's pretty different from a matplotlib, because now what a Seaborn function usually takes, it's actually the name of the data frame. And then as the argument, at least for this function bar plot, it will needs to have the name of the column that you want to plot. That's it. Don't have to play with arrays or anything. It will organize everything that way. So let's run it. Is it going to work? I wonder. Maybe I should actually run this before. Yes, okay, everything worked. Good. So let's run it, and yeah, that's it. So you see, I mean, one line here for the matter of not having a super long line, we could like chop it. Here after a comma, you can just go to the next line, but it's the equivalent of writing this in one line. You'll find out that this plotting function needs a lot of arguments. So having them here nicely separated with different lines is probably a good way to see what's happening. And so yeah, so here I like to actually have a little cap size. By default, there is no cap size as far as I remember, but if you want to change it, because I love them, you can make them bigger that way. And this height here could be different information. So you can define here with this argument ci, that in this example, I want the standard deviation to be used. But there are many ways to actually represent your error bar. So you can use different method by using this argument. Again, if you don't like this line because you think that it's really like not aesthetic in your beautiful Jupyter notebook, remember that the functions returns always something. So if you now return into this underscore variable, it will not appear anymore. So I'm not sure I will do this every single time for this lecture, but if you like to have a final, very polished notebook Jupyter, you can always use this little trick. So wonderful. I mean, it looks, I have to say, very nice. And you can see like how actually Barplot understood exactly the way the data was organized by different categories. And that's what actually was actually including this df underscore median data frame. You can go on top if you don't remember how we have created this, but you can see that one plot gives you all these statistics. Okay, we can do another variant. So now this one is called a box plot. Okay, so let's see how it looks like. That's actually a very nice way to now represent the data where we now have, so the data that we gave here is the initial data frame, and we have in the x-axis the month, as we mentioned here, and the y-axis are the passengers, and you can see that you have this trend, and you're not surprised to see that during the summer, there are more passengers. That looks very nice, but I'm a little bit annoyed by this. So I think something we are going to describe also later in this lecture, but I cannot let it that way. It's not nice. So I'm just going to use this little trick here. So you see that when I created a graph, I return it in the object P, and I can use then this object P to modify that graph. And again, you have to go to the Seaborn manual, and you have to see what are the different functions that are available. We're going to discuss this a little bit later in this lecture, but I couldn't resist here to show you how to fix this. So we can set X tick labels, okay? That's what we want. So I just actually Googled that and I found that. So, and then what it takes as an input, as arguments, is actually these objects that actually contains information about the X ticks label. And then I can rotate them. I can use any rotation. It could be 90 degrees or 45 degrees. So I'm going to run it and that's it. So come on, that's way nicer. Good. So let's move forward because there are so many ways to plot the data with Seaborn. And here I gave you examples, but you can see that you just need one line to produce these beautiful plots. Okay, another variant is actually the box plots that actually give a little bit more information about the statistic distribution. And exactly, I think these boxes corresponds to different quantiles of the data. So especially if you have a large data set, it's a nice way to see how it distributes. I mean, here it's a small data set, so it's not as informative, but that gives a little bit more information that the box plot. So again, you can very quickly change one function to another. They take exactly the same input arguments. Okay. Oh, I like this one. So the heat map. It's one of my favorite way to use Seaborn. So the first thing to illustrate how to use a heat map, we have to take our df-wide information, and there is in my heat map something I don't want to plot at the month because the month is not associated to any value, and it doesn't make sense to have my month in my heat map, so I can drop it to get rid of it. So axis equal 1 because I want to get rid of the entire column, and then I can probably show my heat map that way. Oh, so I think, you know, it's like I have an issue with my df-y drop here, and I think it's because I have done something earlier in my code that modified this. And let me see what's happening. This is the pleasure of giving a class online, modifying all these data frames to give you the best examples, and then the code doesn't work anymore because I've been too wild. So let's go. That's, I thought, pretty much what I wanted. I try to fix this. If I cannot, I will tell you what is it supposed to be. And let's move on. So I just want to, again, see how I created this df y data. Oh, I think, is it because df-y doesn't have month? Let me just check. Okay. Not a column, you're right. So does it mean that if I do this, it's going to work? That example was working indeed. Yes, thank you, thank you, Mark. So df-y should work, but what about if I now, okay, so I print df-y, I will do something here, and if I print here, columns, okay, so I just want these columns. So if I don't want to get bothered, I'm just going to copy this and see what's happening. It's maybe the most elegant way to do it, but I'm sure. Oh, heat map axis. This is why it is not working. I had these things, yeah. Okay, almost there. Heat map, and I'm taking just these arguments. Again, I know exactly what's missing here. I'm missing some brackets, and this is how fix things together. Here we are. So it's because across my examples, I didn't remember what was my how it looked like. So again, go back to your data. If you don't create like a lot of different data frames the way I've done it today, you can use here this little function, oops, and then you'll have an idea how it looks like. Okay, I had the month here, and this is my index. So that's, and I think I've changed here later on. So that's what happened. Anyway, this is working. And I like to say, when actually I pull these different columns, it's important that it takes actually a list here. So that's why my mistake. So it has to take a list of different columns. Great. So this is my my heat map. However, you can see you have here the color gradient. So the lighter should correspond to a higher number of passengers. We have a y-axis corresponding to here the month, and here the years. So that's good. If I can maybe change the colors, because you can see that here we have way less passengers that in this for this 5 years period time. So the color code is applied to the entire data set, and that's why it looks not that I would say informative. I would like to have a gradient that would be normalized. So, normalized, that's something we've seen before. So I think I cheated, and let's see if it's going to work. But I have actually here normalize the data. If it doesn't work, it's not a big deal. And I think it worked, so it didn't complain. And I'm going to uncomment these lines. So okay, great. So that worked. That's almost a miracle. But I used actually a simple here normalization. I think this is a very simple normalization. I just divided the value by the maximum value again. For this, we use lambda, we use apply, and I just here do a simple normalization when I divide by the maximum value. Again, it's important when I do this that I do this by axis, and that's what I expect. And you see that this lighter colors that represent to the higher number of passengers is now nicely normalized for the summer month. So yes, that's the way you can play with actually heat maps. You can change the colors. I think I gave, I'm gonna comment here. I don't want to do this again, but I think I can use CMap. It's something I will describe later. But if you want to change the color code when you actually use heat map, you can define a different palette that you want to use. And again, you have to go to the manual of heat map. You have a lot of different palettes, a lot of different ranges of colors that you can use. This is, I think, one that makes more sense to me, because I don't like to have the lighter color representing the higher number of passengers. Doesn't make sense to me. So I think if I run it that way, I have this new color bars with the new colors, and now you can see that all these values are associated to this new range of palettes. So I'll describe how to play with this later in this lecture, but again, it's going to be step by step. You'll have a lot of different arguments that are that you can use when you run any of these plotting function, especially heat map. There are tons of them. CMap is one of the most useful one, and you will use CMap whenever you have to play with the different colors. What I didn't say here also, I can put the title and yeah, but that's something I'll describe later on. But you see here that we could also define the label for the X and Y axis, and actually the title for our plots. Okay, now the swarm plots. Okay, so let's apply it again. We are going to apply it to DF median data. We are going to give the X and Y column that can be used. And we are going to use another argument that is also very important in Seaborn. It's a way to deal with the categories. So when you have categories, when you use actually hue, you will understand that it has to use this column for categories for your plot. So let's see how it looks like. So now, because you have used this, it creates actually 5 plots. Each of these plots will be automatically will have a color, and you can see that it's also by default giving you a legend, and that's actually a nice way here to see how over time, again, you can change here the orientation of your month, but you can see the evolution of the number of passengers during the year. And that's what you do with a line plot. So the line plot is the most basic way to plot different columns. If you want to actually use the one plot, you can just use the same command, but then you can just use this function. And what it tells you, it's instead of giving you this graph, it's actually going to put the points in a different locations so that they will not overlap. And it's a great way to actually show visually a distribution of points. It's a new trendy representation that is used a lot in biology. I'm sure that if you work with replicates, that's typically, or with a single cell, a single molecule, that's a nice way to show every single data. And here you actually can represent your data that way. It's maybe not the best illustrative way to use one plots, but if you Google one plot, you'll see a lot of these, and you see how they're very useful to have a good idea of the distribution where each point here is represented. Okay, so then we have 15 minutes, so I will have to go a little bit faster, but that's something that we have already covered. It's how to change the color palettes. So you have a lot of options, and it's pretty quick to change the colors of your graphs. Here, what you can do, for instance, you can create a palette, and what you can give as your palette is different information. So, for instance, the number of points that you want to plot. So here, the number of colors that you want is going to give you the number of, it's here and call. So if you print and call, you have 4, okay, because you have 4 categories corresponding here to the 5-year periods. And then you can, so a palette is a circular. Again, I cannot show it how the palette look like, but if you just Google Seaborn palette, you'll see that it's a circular description of a range of colors, and you can define 2 different parameters. You can define where you start on the palette, and then the rotation actually of the palette. So it's a wheel, this is the way it's called, and if you change these parameters, you'll see that it will produce different colors. And so when I use now this command, it returns my new palette that I print here. I plot here, so there are 4 colors and they look nice. If I change that, I don't know if it's going to work. I'm colorblind, so I'm not sure it's going to be nice, but it probably has changed something now. I cannot see it, but play with these parameters and you'll see how you will actually find different colors for your graph. I have to go a little bit faster, but again, there are different ways to do it. Now I can just redo exactly the same bar plot, but I can give as an argument the palette that I have created with this command. So you create your palette the way you like, and then you just give your palette as an argument to any plotting function. Also, remember that Seaborn is an add-on of Matplotlib, so you can use a lot of Matplotlib functions when you play with a Seaborn. So that's here what we are going to discuss about. For instance, you can change the size of your figures. So let's see. Here, using this figure function that takes an argument called figure size, we can change the size of your figure. If you want to make it super long, I can make it a bit longer and not reduce the height. That's the way to do it. Again, you can call this function before any graph that you produce. And if you want to then print this graph, you can always use plt.show, something that we have covered during the last class. If you don't want to change for every single graph the shape of your figure, you can use this little trick that is here mentioned here. So you define the height and how wide is your figure. And then if you just apply this function, every single plot will have that size. That's probably what we're going to do here. Okay. That's okay. That's great. I think here this is an example that I already gave to you, how to rotate the ticks of your plots. So you can do it for your X and Y or Y ticks. This technique to do it is a little bit different from the one I showed you before. So you can use one or the other. Again, think and keep in mind that Seaborn is an add-on on Matplotlib. So whatever you can do with Seaborn, there is probably another way to do it using Matplotlib. So comparing how we rotate here the X ticks, it's a little bit different from what I showed you before. Just stick to one, the one that makes more sense to you. Maybe stick to Seaborn if you really like Seaborn, but you find out many solutions to make your graph nicer. Also, you have noticed that Seaborn compared to a Matplotlib gives you this colorful background and a lot of default values to make your graph nice. If you want to change these default values, you can change the style of your Seaborn environment. For instance, if you don't like this colorful background, you can just run this simple command. Again, it will change the environment for your Seaborn, meaning that if you enter this command, you don't have to do it again for the following graphs. And if you get lost with a style, there is a command that I don't remember exactly, but you can reset your style to the default Seaborn environment. So let's do it. So now I want my background to be white. So I run it, and yeah, it looks white. So that's maybe nicer. And I have to say, we are close to have a very Toby, thank you. Set. Okay, that was easy. But that's a nice way, because if you play with a graph and you want to reset and have something that looks like a little bit more the way it looks at the origin, that's very practical. I believe that with time you will have your own taste about how you like your graph. So all these different functions and this Seaborn environment, same for Matplotlib, you will actually set it at the beginning of your Jupyter notebook, because whenever you start a new project, you like your graph to look in a particular way. So you'll get familiar with all these different ways to play with the environment and how to make your graph look nice to you. For example, I'm a colorblind person, so I use a very particular palette. And whenever I start a new Jupyter notebook, I just enter this by default on top of my notebook just after I import all my libraries, and I don't have to think about it. Automatically, all my graph will have already this same look. Okay, so I think I'll give you now a couple of examples. What about this one? So setting plot title. Okay, that's an example again to actually tell you how you can set the title, how you can set the labels. Let's run it. Okay, so that's the way to do it. I think you'll find that I used already these comments earlier in this notebook. And okay, that's a little example. I'm not sure that it's an example that matters to you, but mostly the data that I have to deal with, or I had to deal with in the past when I was doing some research, they were just signals. So there were a series of some signal over time. And I like to plot together all my duplicates experiments, for instance. And I could use here this plot called rel plot. It's actually great to plot this kind of information. So rel plot means relational plots. So this is just a little trick that I used. I can just give you some hints and ideas about how I created from scratch some data set here that can be used for this type of graph. So I create, it's a little bit of a recap on a lot of things we've seen together, but I create here a table, and I want to create in a for loop 5 different data sets because let's assume I have done my experiments 5 times. So I can create X and a Y. A Y here is a sinus of my X, and I can add some noise that way. There is here a nice way to actually create a data frame. So from that, I could actually use zip. This is for Toby, his favorite word. But again, a zip is a great way to actually change the dimension of my data. So here zip takes 2 arguments. It takes X, Y, and I created as a third here list, I created a string that contains the number of my experiments. And then I put everything in the data frame. Here the data frame takes as an input to create it my tuple, and then the name of my column. So that's maybe just an example that mattered to me. And you can always create your data very simply using all these Python tools. So yes, that's the way I created my random data. So I think I can change the number of points I have. I have my time, I have the signal, and I have actually a lot of points from different experiments. And this is how actually this rel plot is useful, because it gives me here an idea of the data for my 5 experiments. And I can use this little trick. So changing just a couple of arguments, it will understand how the data is organized, and it will actually give me some idea, which is more or less an average of all my data, and gives me like some idea of the deviation for each time point. So again, that's a very quick way to represent your data if you don't want to start with crazy statistics. And since I have 5 minutes, I will just finish with another Seaborn function that I really like. It's called a join plot. I use it all the time. And to illustrate this, I wanted to finish with something positive. You might be a little bit exhausted with all these advanced Panda tricks. So again, you can visit this wonderful website that actually is made from the city of New York. And they provide a lot of data sets that are already in a CSV format. So you can just, I downloaded it, and you'll find that file in your lecture 13 directory. You can, in one line, and always amazed that by this, one line, you just load the entire data set. Okay, and after, what I can do, I can just plot it, and I will, so here this data set, we actually representing the cafe that actually Sidewalk Cafe in New York City, because I think you're all dreaming about it right now. So soon you'll go back to and walk in New York, and maybe you might be interested where this cafe is located. What would be your best neighborhood to go out to have a little coffee somewhere outside and enjoy the sun? So you can look at this data frame. It has a lot of information. A lot of this information here doesn't make a lot of sense. Okay, the business name, the street, the building. The only thing I wanted to show here was actually the longitude and the latitude of these places. So if I use actually as an X for longitude and Y for latitude, here the F, it's the data frame that I could import it from that CSV file. I can change different arguments, especially n-level is an argument that is specific to a joint plot. And if I run it, it will look like this. Okay, so I have the latitude and I have the longitude, and it seems that I might have some outliers because it looks like that it could be like New York City from far away. But you can see that there is probably a point that is an outlier, a point here. So I don't know why the data is probably not clean. I imagine that there is a point here that doesn't really belong to New York City. That must be somewhere in New Jersey. So I can use lock again. I'm going to filter by the longitude. So I just want now to super easy again filter my data. I just want to have only the data where the longitude is in this range. And I'm going to run it again. And this is, yeah, so if you are very good in geography and you have a good sense of imagination, you can see that this is New York City. You have here Manhattan, and that's probably Long Island City, and you have here Brooklyn. And you can see that really, if you want to enjoy a good terrace, downtown sounds to be a good place with a lot of coffee places available. And if you want to add something on a joint plot, and that joint plot, and that's also like another great way to add different layers on a Seaborn plot. You can again plot something on top. So here I'm going to plot some scattered information. So I will plot one marker for each of my row. And I can make it transparent here. I can change the color and I can change the size of this marker. But basically, while here I have a density, I can also add one single spot corresponding to one single cup of coffee. And this is the way it looks like. So you can superimpose your different Seaborn plots that way. There are, again, many ways to play with this. And finally, if you want to save it, you can just use this matplotlib function called Savefig. You enter the name of the file. It could be a PNG or a PDF. If it's a PNG, you can add the resolution you want to have. You can also, and I recommend this argument, transparent, especially it's useful if you want to create a PDF so that you'll be able to play against with that figure and Illustrator if you like to play with the vectorial images. But that's pretty much what I wanted to say. There is something very funny if you like to play with. It's you can make your graph like they were drawn by hand, and you just have to run this. If you run this now, I think you can rerun any of these functions, all of them, and it should give you something like that. So you can again rerun all these different plots, and they will look like as cartoony as this one. And again, if you want to get rid of this, you have to reset your environment because I mean it's fun, but that's probably not what you want for your final figure. Thank you again. That's it for this lecture. I think we can stop recording the video and